Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. Sometimes that chance comes in the form of an impossible challenge that everyone says you can't win. In Jasper's Bluff, wealthy widow Delilah Vane owned a beautiful stallion named Sabbath who refused to be ridden. 18 cowboys tried to break him and failed. Then came Tom Rusk, a man in his 50s who'd lost his ranch and his son. While others used force, Tom used kindness. He saw something in this stubborn horse that reminded him of himself. What happened next would change both their lives forever. But could a broken man really turn the laziest horse in the West into a champion? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Jasper's Bluff in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where horses' hooves had worn deep grooves in the hard-packed earth. This was cattle country, where fortunes rose and fell with the seasons, and where a man's worth was measured not by the coins in his pocket, but by how he sat a horse and treated his neighbors. The air carried the familiar scents of leather, hay, and the ever-present dust that seemed to settle on everything, giving the town a weathered patina that spoke of hard work and harder winters. Delilah Vane's stables sat at the edge of town, like a monument to prosperity, their red-painted boards gleaming in the early light. At 62, Delilah moved through her domain with the confidence of a woman who had carved out her own place in a man's world. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her keen blue eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the corrals that housed the finest horses west of the Mississippi. She wore her wealth quietly good boots, a simple dress of fine fabric, and her late husband's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. The crown jewel of her collection stood alone in the largest paddock, a magnificent black stallion whose coat shimmered like polished obsidian in the morning light. Sabbath was poetry in motion when he chose to be, with lines that spoke of thoroughbred breeding and a spirit that had never been truly broken. At 4 years old, he stood 16 hands high, with a chest broad enough to carry a king and legs that promised speed beyond measure. Yet for all his beauty, Sabbath had earned a reputation that made even the boldest cowboys think twice. "That horse has the devil in him," old Pete Garrison would mutter from his spot on the general store porch, watching the stallion pace his enclosure with the restless energy of a caged storm. "Ain't natural, the way he looks at a man, like he's planning something." The truth was simpler and more complex than the townspeople imagined. Sabbath wasn't mean-spirited or vicious, was particular. He had thrown 18 riders in the past 2 years, not out of malice, but out of an almost human sense of dignity. He seemed to weigh each cowboy who approached, finding them wanting in ways that only he understood. Some he would suffer to mount before depositing them gently in the dust. Others he would simply walk away from, as if their very presence offended his sensibilities. Tom Rusk had watched the 18th failure from the rail fence that bordered Delilah's property, his weathered hands gripping the top rail as another would-be horsebreaker limped away with wounded pride and a story that would grow in the telling. Tom understood something about wounded pride. At 54, he carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had once stood tall, but had learned to bend before breaking entirely. His face was a roadmap of hard years lines, etched by sun and wind, grey stubble that he kept neatly trimmed, despite his reduced circumstances, and brown eyes that held depths of experience, both bitter and sweet. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places with the careful stitches of a man who had learned to make do. The silver spurs on his boots were the only things about him that still gleamed, passed down from his father, and his father, before him, a legacy of cowboy tradition that seemed increasingly out of place in the modern world. Tom lived in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on Elm Street, a modest affair that catered to drifters and down-on-their-luck ranch hands. His room was small but spotless, containing little more than a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk that held the remnants of his former life. Among those remnants was a photograph of a young boy on a pinto pony, both smiling at the camera with the unconscious joy of a perfect summer day. The boy was his son Danny, though that photo was 15 years old now, and the distance between them felt like centuries. The loss of his ranch to debt and drought had cost Tom more than property. It had cost him his identity. For 30 years, the Rusk name had meant something in these parts. His spread had been modest, but well regarded, his horses known for their gentleness and good training. He had been a man of substance, someone whose word carried weight and whose opinion mattered at the monthly cattle association meetings. Now he swept floors at the saloon and mucked stalls for anyone who would pay him $1 a day. The work was honest, but it sat heavy on shoulders that had once borne the responsibility of his own land and his own future. He did the jobs without complaint, but sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, he would lie in his narrow bed and remember what it felt like to walk his own fence line, to plan for seasons that stretched ahead with possibility. Delilah had watched Tom from her kitchen window more than once, noting the way he moved among horses with a quiet confidence that the flashier cowboys lacked. There was something in his manner patient, respectful, unhurried, that reminded her of her late husband, Marcus. Marcus had been gone 5 years now, taken by a fever that no amount of money could cure, leaving her with more wealth than she could spend and a loneliness that money couldn't touch. The oil painting that dominated her parlor showed Marcus in his prime, astride his favorite horse with the Rocky Mountains rising behind them. He had been the kind of cowboy that songs were written about, brave, honest, skilled with rope and rifle alike. Their marriage had been one of equals, built on mutual respect and shared dreams. She had been more than his wife. She had been his partner in building something lasting in this unforgiving country. Marcus had always said that you could tell a man's character by how he treated animals and children, those who couldn't defend themselves or argue back. It was a philosophy that had guided Delilah's judgment of men for decades, and it was what made her notice Tom Rusk when others overlooked him. The morning she announced her challenge, the saloon fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Delilah stood near the bar, her posture erect and her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Sabbath needs a rider worthy of him," she said simply. "The man who can turn him into a rodeo champion by summer's end will earn my respect and a place in my stables. The one who can't, well, there's no shame in recognizing your limitations." The laughter that followed was nervous, edged with the kind of masculine pride that made smart men do foolish things. Cowboys began placing side bets immediately, arguing over who would be the 19th to try and fail. Money changed hands with the casual ease of men who had little to lose and less to gain. Tom sat in the corner, nursing a whiskey that he was making last the full evening. He had been thinking about leaving Jasper's Bluff, maybe heading north where the mining camps always needed men willing to work hard for steady pay. The idea of spending his remaining years in the company of rocks and strangers held little appeal, but it beat the slow erosion of dignity that came with each passing month in a place where everyone remembered what he used to be. But something in Delilah's challenge stirred something in his chest that he thought had died with his ranch. Perhaps it was the way she spoke of the horse, with respect rather than conquest in her voice. Perhaps it was the way Sabbath himself stood in his paddock, proud and unbroken, despite 2 years of failed attempts to claim him. Or perhaps it was simply the desperate need of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. When Tom stood and walked toward Delilah, the saloon's chatter died like a snuffed candle. His spurs rang against the wooden floor with each measured step, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet confidence of a man who had made his decision. "Mrs. Vane," he said, touching the brim of his hat with old-world courtesy, "I'd like to try my hand with your Sabbath, if you'll have me." The silence stretched like a held breath, broken finally by someone's snort of laughter. But Delilah studied Tom's face with the intensity of a woman reading the fine print on a contract. She saw something there, that the others missed, a flicker of the man he had been, perhaps, or the shadow of someone he might yet become. "Very well, Mr. Rusk," she said formally. "You have until the annual rodeo in August. 3 months to make something of yourself and my horse." As Tom walked home through the cool night air, the weight of what he had committed to settled on his shoulders like a familiar yoke. Behind him, the saloon erupted in renewed conversation and wagers, most of them against his chances. Ahead of him lay the hardest challenge of his life, and perhaps his last chance at redemption. In her paddock, Sabbath lifted his magnificent head and watched the man with the quiet walk disappear into the darkness. Something in the horse's posture suggested that he, too, was waiting to see what the morning would bring. The sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern peaks when Tom arrived at Delilah's stables the next morning, carrying a canvas bag that contained the few tools of his trade currycombs, a hoof pick, and a length of soft cotton rope that his father had braided 40 years ago. The morning air was crisp with the promise of spring, and the sound of his boots on the gravel path seemed unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. Delilah emerged from the main barn, carrying a steaming cup of coffee, her grey hair already pinned back for the day's work. She wore practical clothes denim trousers and a cotton shirt that spoke of a woman who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty despite her means. Her sharp eyes took in Tom's early arrival with obvious approval. Most men would have slept off the whiskey and shown up around noon with apologies and excuses, she said, offering him the cup. "I'm beginning to think I may have underestimated you, Mr. Rusk." Tom accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma before taking a careful sip. It was better than anything he'd tasted in months' real coffee beans, not the chicory mixture that was all he could afford at the boarding house. "My father taught me that a man's word is only as good as his first effort to keep it," he replied. "Figured I'd best start as I mean to continue." They walked together toward the large paddock where Sabbath stood, silhouetted against the lightening sky. The stallion was magnificent in the morning light, his black coat rippling over muscles that spoke of power held in careful check. His head was high, ears forward, watching their approach with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "What do you see when you look at him?" Delilah asked, stopping at the fence rail. Tom studied the horse for a long moment, noting the way Sabbath held himself proud but not arrogant, alert but not fearful. "I see a horse that's been asked the wrong questions," he said finally. "Everyone who's tried to ride him has been asking, 'How can I make you do what I want?' I think the better question might be, 'What do you need from me?'" Delilah turned to look at Tom with new interest. "You sound like my Marcus used to talk. He always said the best horsemen were listeners first and riders second." "Your husband was a wise man," Tom said quietly. "I remember hearing stories about him when I was younger. They said he could gentle a wild Mustang with nothing but patience and understanding." "He could," Delilah said, her voice soft with memory. "He also said that the most difficult horses often made the best partners once they decided to trust you. They just needed someone worthy of that trust." The formal contract that would govern their agreement was written on Delilah's personal stationery, the kind of heavy paper that spoke of quality and permanence. She had drafted it herself in her flowing script, outlining the terms with the precision of someone accustomed to important business dealings. Tom would have access to Sabbath every day from dawn to dusk. He would be provided with feed, equipment, and use of the training ring. In return, he would prepare the horse for the annual rodeo competition, where success would be measured not just by staying mounted, but by demonstrating true partnership between horse and rider. "I'm not asking you to break him," Delilah explained as Tom read through the document. "Any fool with a whip and spurs can break a horse's spirit. I'm asking you to train him to bring out the best of what he already is." Tom signed his name with the careful penmanship of a man who had been educated in an era when handwriting mattered. The ink was barely dry when they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats on the main road. A group of cowboys from the Lazy J Ranch rode into view, led by Jake Morrison, a man in his 30s who had a reputation for flash and swagger that exceeded his actual skill. "Well, well," Jake called out as he reined in his paint horse near the fence. "If it isn't the famous Tom Rusk, come to show us all how it's done." His companions laughed appreciatively, emboldened by their leader's mockery. Jake was everything that Tom was not: young, cocky, dressed in expensive leather chaps, and a hat that had never seen honest work. He rode with the careless confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything that mattered. His spurs were silver-plated, his belt buckle the size of a dinner plate, and his horse was trained to rear and prance on command for the admiration of saloon girls and impressionable young men. "Just aiming to do right by the horse," Tom replied evenly, not rising to the bait. "Right by the horse?" Jake's grin turned ugly. "Old man, that devil's put better riders than you'll ever be in the dirt. What makes you think you can succeed where real cowboys have failed?" Tom felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, the kind that had gotten him into trouble in his younger days. But age and hard experience had taught him the value of choosing his battles carefully. "I guess we'll find out come August," he said simply. Jake's expression darkened at what he perceived as dismissal. "I tell you what, old-timer, when you're picking yourself up out of that paddock, you will remember that some of us tried to save you the embarrassment." The Cowboys rode off in a cloud of dust and laughter, leaving Tom and Delilah standing by the fence. The morning's peaceful beginning had been shattered, replaced by the weight of public expectation and the certainty that his every move would be watched and judged. "Don't let them get under your skin," Delilah advised. "Jake Morrison is all hat and no cattle, as my Marcus used to say. He's never met a challenge he couldn't walk away from when the real work started." But Tom knew that Jake's words, however poorly motivated, contained a grain of truth. 18 skilled riders had tried and failed with Sabbath. What made him think he would be different? What did he possess that younger, stronger men lacked? The answer came to him as he climbed through the fence rails and entered Sabbath's paddock for the first time. The stallion watched his approach with ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring slightly as he took Tom's scent. There was no fear in the horse's posture, but there was wariness, the careful attention of a creature that had learned to expect disappointment from humans. Tom stopped 10 feet away and simply stood, making no move to approach closer. He had learned long ago that horses, like people, needed space to make their own decisions. Forcing the issue only led to resistance and mistrust. "Hello, Sabbath," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same tone he might use with a skittish child. "I'm Tom. I know you've had your fill of cowboys trying to climb on your back, and I don't blame you for being particular about the company you keep." The horse's ears swiveled forward, tracking the sound of Tom's voice. There was something in his dark eyes that spoke of intelligence and perhaps loneliness, the isolation of a creature that had been judged and found wanting by those who should have understood him better. "I've got nowhere else to be, and nothing better to do," Tom continued conversationally. "So I figure we might as well get to know each other. No hurry, no pressure, just two old souls trying to figure out what comes next." Sabbath took a tentative step forward, then stopped, as if testing Tom's reaction. When the man remained still and calm, the horse took another step, and then another, until they stood close enough that Tom could see his own reflection in the stallion's dark eyes. "That's it," Tom murmured. "Take all the time you need. I've got nothing but time these days." From the fence, Delilah watched this first encounter with growing amazement. She had seen 18 men enter that paddock with ropes and determination, only to leave with bruised egos and dusty clothes. Yet here was Tom Rusk, making no attempt to assert dominance or establish control, and Sabbath was responding like a flower turning toward the sun. The breakthrough moment came when Sabbath lowered his great head and blew softly through his nostrils, a horse's way of greeting a friend. Tom remained perfectly still, letting the warm breath wash over his shoulder, and when Sabbath didn't immediately pull away, he slowly raised his hand and rested it gently on the stallion's neck. The contact lasted only a few seconds before Sabbath stepped back, but it was enough. Tom had been accepted for consideration, admitted to the exclusive circle of humans worthy of the horse's attention. It was a privilege that 18 other men had been denied, and Tom understood the weight of the gift he had been given. "Well, I'll be." Delilah breathed from her place at the fence. "Marcus always said you could tell everything you needed to know about a man by watching him with horses and children. Looks like Sabbath agrees." As the morning progressed, Tom established the routine that would govern their relationship. He made no attempt to rush the process, content to let Sabbath set the pace of their interaction. When the horse moved away, Tom gave him space. When he approached, Tom remained calm and welcoming. It was a dance as old as the partnership between man and horse, requiring patience, respect, and a willingness to earn trust rather than demand obedience. By noon, when the sun was high and hot, Tom had accomplished something that none of his predecessors had managed. He had spent 3 hours in Sabbath's company without being rejected, kicked, or bitten. It wasn't much by most standards, but it was a beginning, and beginnings were precious things to a man who had forgotten how to hope. The town's reaction was swift and predictable. By evening, word had spread through every saloon and general store that crazy Tom Rusk had spent the day standing around in a paddock, talking to a horse like it was his grandmother. The betting odds, which had already heavily favored failure, shifted even further against him. But Tom didn't care about the odds or the gossip. As he walked back to the boarding house that evening, he carried with him the memory of Sabbath's gentle greeting and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another chance to build on what they had started. For the first time in years, he had a purpose that extended beyond simple survival, and that purpose felt like the first green shoot of spring pushing through the hard-packed earth of his despair. The leather journal that Tom carried had seen better days, its cover worn smooth by years of handling, and its pages yellowed at the edges. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man who believed that any knowledge worth having was worth writing down. Tom had taken to recording his observations about Sabbath each evening by lamplight, noting the horse's moods, preferences, and the small victories that marked their growing relationship. Day 3, he wrote in his careful script, Sabbath allowed me to approach from the left side today, something he's refused with others. Noticed he favors his right front hoof slightly when turning. Not lame, just careful, will watch for signs of old injury. He responds well to low voices, seems agitated by quick movements. The morning ritual had become sacred to both man and horse. Tom would arrive before dawn with a thermos of coffee and a piece of bread saved from his meager breakfast. He would sit on an overturned bucket just outside the paddock fence and eat slowly, talking quietly to Sabbath about whatever came to mind: the weather, the birds beginning their morning songs, memories of horses he had known and loved. Sabbath had begun waiting for these conversations, standing near the fence with his ears forward, occasionally nickering softly as if adding his own commentary to Tom's rambling observations. It was a sound that Tom had begun to treasure, a sign that the great horse was choosing to engage rather than simply tolerate his presence. "You remind me of a horse I used to have," Tom said one morning, watching Sabbath methodically work his way through a pile of fresh hay. Name was Copper, on account of his color. He was particular, too. Wouldn't let just anyone handle him, but once you earned his trust, he'd follow you to hell and back. The stallion's ears flicked at the mention of the other horse, and Tom could have sworn he saw understanding in those dark, intelligent eyes. Horses had long memories and longer grudges, but they also had a capacity for forgiveness that humbled most humans. The trick was proving yourself worthy of that forgiveness. Tom's approach differed radically from the methods employed by his 18 predecessors. Where they had brought whips and spurs, he brought patience. Where they had sought to dominate, he offered partnership. Where they had demanded immediate results, he was content to measure progress in minutes rather than miles. The breakthrough came on the 7th day, when Sabbath voluntarily approached Tom while he sat writing in his journal. The horse extended his great neck over the fence and blew warm breath on the pages, as if curious about the marks that seemed to hold Tom's attention so completely. "Want to know what I'm writing about you?" Tom asked softly, looking up into those liquid brown eyes. "I'm writing that you're smarter than most people I know, and twice as dignified. I'm writing that you've got good reason to be careful about who you trust." Tom's hand moved slowly, telegraphing his intentions long before he made contact with Sabbath's velvet muzzle. The horse allowed the touch, even leaning slightly into the gentle pressure of Tom's weathered palm. It was a moment of pure connection, unmarred by agenda or expectation. "There you are," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "There's my boy." From the kitchen window of her farmhouse, Delilah watched this daily drama with growing fascination. She had seen countless men work with horses over the years, but none with Tom's particular combination of patience and intuition. He seemed to understand that Sabbath's cooperation couldn't be taken, it could only be offered, and only to someone worthy of the gift. The townspeople's reaction to Tom's methods ranged from amusement to open derision. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, Jake Morrison held court most evenings, regaling anyone who would listen with exaggerated accounts of Tom's revolutionary technique of standing around doing nothing. "I swear on my mother's grave," Jake would say, his voice carrying across the smoke-filled room, "I saw the old fool reading to that horse like it was his Sunday school class. Next thing you know, he'll be tucking it in with a bedtime story." The laughter that followed was cruel and cutting, but it bothered Tom less than it might have in his younger days. He had learned the hard way that other people's opinions carried no weight when measured against the quiet satisfaction of work done well. Still, the mockery stung, particularly when it came from men who had never faced the kind of loss that had brought him to this point. The physical demands of working with Sabbath were beginning to take their toll on Tom's aging body. His back, damaged by years of hard ranch work and a particularly bad fall from a green bronc in his 40s, ached constantly now. The standing, bending, and careful movements required by his gentle approach left him exhausted by evening, forcing him to rely on the hot baths that Mrs. Henderson grudgingly allowed her boarders to take twice a week. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she observed one evening as Tom limped through the front door, his face grey with fatigue. "That horse isn't worth crippling yourself over." But Tom knew better. Sabbath was worth every ache, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt that plagued him in the small hours before dawn. The horse represented something precious that Tom had thought lost forever, the possibility of redemption, of proving that he was still capable of something meaningful. The memories came unbidden during the quiet hours he spent with Sabbath, triggered by the familiar sounds and smells of the stable. He remembered teaching his son Danny to ride on a gentle mare named Buttercup, his small hands barely able to grip the reins while his father walked alongside, one protective hand always ready to steady the boy if he faltered. Danny had been 7 then, all knees and elbows and unbridled enthusiasm for anything that moved faster than his own legs could carry him. He had possessed his father's natural seat and his mother's fearless spirit, a combination that had made him a joy to watch and a terror to worry about. "Hold your heels down, son," Tom had coached gently, the same words he now found himself repeating to Sabbath as he slowly introduced the concept of accepting human direction. "Feel the horse beneath you. Let him know you're listening to what he's trying to tell you." Those had been golden days, when the future stretched ahead like an endless summer, and every sunset promised tomorrow would bring new adventures. Tom's ranch had been modest but profitable then, his reputation solid, his family intact. He had been a man of substance, someone whose opinion mattered at the Cattlemen's Association meetings and whose handshake was as good as any contract. The loss of it, all ranch, reputation, relationship with his son had happened gradually, then suddenly. The drought that lasted 3 years running, the drop in cattle prices, the bank loans that seemed reasonable at the time, but compounded into impossible obligations. He had fought to save everything, sacrificing first his comfort, then his pride, and finally his hope. Danny, grown to manhood and disgusted by his father's failures, had left for opportunities back east, his goodbye, coldly polite and seemingly final. The ranch had gone to the bank, the cattle sold at auction, the horses dispersed to whoever would take them. Tom had been left with nothing but his father's spurs and a lifetime of skills that seemed increasingly worthless in a changing world. But now, standing in Sabbath's paddock with the morning sun warming his shoulders, Tom felt the first stirring of something he had thought dead forever. It wasn't hope exactly, that would be too much to ask. But it was possibility, the sense that perhaps his story wasn't finished after all. Sabbath seemed to sense the shift in Tom's mood, stepping closer and resting his great head against the man's shoulder in a gesture of comfort that was purely instinctive. Horses were sensitive to human emotion in ways that most people never realized, capable of offering solace without words or judgment. "You understand, don't you, boy?" Tom murmured, his hand finding the sweet spot behind Sabbath's ears that made the horse's eyes half close with pleasure. "You know what it's like to have folks expect things from you that you're not ready to give." The first real test came at the end of the second week, when Tom decided to introduce a lead rope to their daily routine. He had been working up to this moment gradually, letting Sabbath become accustomed to his touch, his voice, his presence in the paddock. Now it was time to see if the trust they had been building was strong enough to support the next level of partnership. The cotton rope was soft and well-worn, nothing like the harsh hemp lines that most cowboys favored. Tom had chosen it specifically for its gentle feel, knowing that Sabbath's acceptance would depend as much on comfort as cooperation. He approached the process with the same patience that had characterized all their interactions, letting the horse see and smell the rope long before he made any attempt to use it. "This is just so we can walk together," Tom explained conversationally, holding the rope where Sabbath could investigate it thoroughly. "Not to pull or force, just to let you know I'm here if you need me." The first time Tom slipped the rope around Sabbath's neck, the horse tensed, but didn't pull away. They stood together in the center of the paddock, man and horse connected by 3 feet of cotton and a growing bond of mutual respect. When Tom took a step forward, Sabbath followed not because he had to, but because he chose to. The rope halter that Tom crafted for Sabbath was a work of art born from necessity and love. Using techniques his grandfather had taught him as a boy, he braided soft cotton fibers into a pattern that would distribute pressure evenly across the horse's head, never pinching or binding even under stress. Each strand was chosen for its strength and flexibility, the knots positioned with mathematical precision to ensure comfort while maintaining control. He worked on it during the long evenings in his boarding house room, his weathered fingers moving with the muscle memory of decades spent working with leather and rope. Mrs. Henderson would sometimes pause outside his door, listening to the quiet sounds of his labortha, whisper of cotton against cotton, the occasional satisfied grunt when a particularly complex section came together properly. "Waste of good rope," she muttered to herself, but Tom caught the softness in her voice that suggested she didn't entirely believe her own words. The halter represented more than just a training tool. It was a symbol of the partnership that Tom hoped to build with Sabbath. Every twist and turn of the rope carried his intention to create something that would serve the horse's comfort as much as his own needs. When he finally held the completed piece up to the lamplight, examining each knot for imperfections, he felt a satisfaction that had been missing from his life for years. Tom's background began to emerge during his increasingly frequent conversations with Delilah, usually conducted across the fence rail while Sabbath grazed peacefully nearby. These talks had a quality of confessional about them, as if the weight of his failures had finally found someone strong enough to bear witness to them. "I had a spread up near Eagle Creek," he told her one morning, his eyes distant with memory. "Nothing fancy, mind you, but it was mine. 300 acres of good grass, a creek that ran year-round, and a house that my granddad built with his own hands." Delilah listened without judgment, recognizing in Tom's voice the particular pain that came from losing something precious. She had known that pain herself when Marcus died, the sense that the world had shifted beneath her feet in ways that could never be corrected. "What happened?" she asked gently, though she suspected she already knew. The story was depressingly common in these parts: drought, debt, and the cruel mathematics of ranching that could destroy a lifetime's work in a matter of seasons. Tom's laugh was bitter but not angry. The usual: 3 years without decent rain, cattle prices fell through the floor, and the bank decided they'd rather have the land than wait for better times. "I fought it for as long as I could, borrowed against everything I owned and some things I didn't. But you can't ranch on hope and stubbornness forever." The loss of his ranch had been only the beginning of Tom's troubles. His wife Sarah, never entirely comfortable with the isolation and uncertainty of ranch life, had seen the financial crisis as an opportunity to pursue the more stable existence she had always craved. The divorce had been civil but devastating, dividing not just their assets but their shared history in ways that left both feeling diminished. Worse still had been the estrangement from Danny, his only son and the heir to generations of Rusk ranching tradition. Danny had been in his final year at college when the ranch failed, preparing for a career in agricultural engineering that would have served him well in the changing world of modern ranching. But the shame of his father's failure and the dissolution of his parents' marriage had soured him on everything connected to the land. "He blames me for not adapting fast enough," Tom admitted to Delilah one afternoon as they watched Sabbath explore his new halter with cautious curiosity. "Says I was too stubborn to see the writing on the wall, too proud to ask for help when it might have made a difference." "Was he right?" Delilah asked, not unkindly. Tom considered the question seriously, as he had many times in the dark hours of sleepless nights. "Maybe. Probably. I was raised to believe that a man stood on his own 2 feet and solved his own problems. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat before the battle was even fought." Sabbath had begun to respond to Tom's voice in ways that amazed even his experienced handler. The horse would lift his head from grazing when he heard Tom's footsteps on the gravel path, would turn toward him with obvious anticipation when he appeared at the fence rail each morning. These small gestures meant more to Tom than all the blue ribbons he had won in his younger days. The breakthrough with the halter came on a Tuesday morning when the air was sharp with the promise of an early spring storm. Tom had been working with Sabbath for 3 weeks, and the horse had grown comfortable with the lead rope and Tom's gentle guidance around the paddock. The halter represented the next step in their partnership, a more formal acknowledgement of the trust that had been building between them. Tom approached the process with his characteristic patience, letting Sabbath investigate every inch of the braided cotton before making any attempt to slip it over his head. The horse sniffed the rope thoroughly, testing its texture with his lips and seeming to approve of its soft construction. "This won't hurt," Tom promised quietly, his hands steady despite the importance of the moment. "It's just so we can understand each other better." Sabbath stood perfectly still as Tom eased the halter into place, his ears forward with interest rather than backward with resistance. When the cotton settled across his pole and the lead rope hung loose and unthreatening, he shook his head experimentally, testing the feel of this new constraint. "Good boy," Tom murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at you, wearing your halter like you were born to it." From the kitchen window, Delilah watched this latest milestone with growing amazement. In 3 weeks, Tom had accomplished what 18 other men had failed to achieve in months of trying. Sabbath was not just tolerating human contact, was actively seeking it, moving toward Tom rather than away, responding to his voice with obvious pleasure. But success brought new challenges, and not all of them involved the horse. The town's initial amusement at Tom's methods was beginning to shift toward something more complex and uncomfortable. His progress with Sabbath was becoming impossible to ignore, and that made some people nervous. Jake Morrison was chief among the doubters, though his skepticism was tinged with something that looked suspiciously like envy. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, his stories about Tom's methods had taken on a sharper edge, moving from mere mockery towards something approaching malice. "Mark my words," Jake declared to his usual audience of cowboys and hangers. "That old fool is using some kind of tricks. Nobody gentle trains a horse that's put 18 good men in the dirt without resorting to witchcraft or worse." The accusation was absurd, but it found fertile ground among men who were uncomfortable with the idea that patience might accomplish more than force, that understanding could prove more powerful than dominance. The suggestion that Tom's success somehow diminished their own abilities as horsemen was particularly galling to those who prided themselves on their rough-and-ready approach to breaking horses. Tom became aware of the changing mood gradually through sideways glances and conversations that stopped when he entered a room. The isolation didn't bother him as much as it might have in the past. He had grown accustomed to being alone with his thoughts and his regrets. But it added a layer of pressure to his work with Sabbath, the knowledge that failure would be met, not just with disappointment, but with active satisfaction from those who resented his unconventional methods. The first major setback came without warning on a Thursday afternoon when spring's first thunderstorm rolled across the valley like a grey-black freight train. Tom had been working with Sabbath in the round pen, practicing simple commands and building their communication through gentle repetition of basic exercises. The storm struck with the sudden violence that characterized mountain weather, transforming a pleasant afternoon into a maelstrom of wind, rain, and splitting thunder. Lightning crackled across the darkened sky in jagged white lines, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with electrical energy. Sabbath, who had been calm and responsive moments before, transformed into something wild and terrified. His eyes rolled white with panic, and his body trembled with the ancient fear that connected him to his Mustang ancestors. The carefully built trust of 3 weeks seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by the primal need to run from danger. Tom found himself facing a 1,300-pound animal in the grip of pure panic, with nothing but a cotton rope and his own experience to keep the situation from turning deadly. The horse reared and plunged, fighting against the halter that moments before had been a symbol of partnership, but now felt like a trap. "Easy, boy," Tom called out, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "It's just noise, can't hurt you, I'm here." But his words seemed to have no effect on the terrified horse. Sabbath's panic was complete and consuming, wiping out weeks of patient progress in a matter of minutes. When the worst of the storm passed, and the horse finally stood still, sides heaving and sweat darkening his black coat, Tom knew that they were back where they had started, maybe worse. That evening, as he sat in his small room listening to the rain drum against the window, Tom wrote in his journal, with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and disappointment. "Setback today. Storm spooked Sabbath badly. 3 weeks of progress lost in 10 minutes. We'll start over tomorrow. Always start over tomorrow." The words were as much a promise to himself as they were an observation about the horse. Starting over had become the theme of his life, and he was beginning to understand that maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Every new beginning carried with it the possibility of doing better, of learning from past mistakes, of finding a different path to the same destination. Outside his window, the storm was finally moving on, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed air and the distant rumble of thunder fading into the eastern mountains. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new opportunities. Tom closed his journal and prepared for sleep, knowing that in a few hours he would once again walk the gravel path to Sabbath's paddock, ready to begin the slow work of rebuilding trust that had been 3 weeks in the making and 10 minutes in the breaking. The letters from Tom's son Danny had arrived sporadically over the years, each one carried in Tom's shirt pocket until the paper grew soft with handling and the creases threatened to separate entirely. He had never opened them, not the first one that came 6 months after Danny left for Chicago, not the subsequent ones that arrived on birthdays and holidays with mechanical regularity. They lay now in his trunk at the boarding house, a small stack of unopened possibilities that represented both his deepest regret and his most fragile hope. The morning after the thunderstorm setback, Tom arrived at Sabbath's paddock to find the horse standing as far from the gate as the enclosure would allow. His dark eyes wary, and his posture suggesting that the previous day's panic had undone more than just their training progress. It had damaged the fundamental trust that had been so carefully constructed over weeks of patient interaction. "I know, boy," Tom said quietly, making no move to enter the paddock. "Yesterday was scary for both of us, but we got through it together, and that has to count for something." He settled onto his familiar overturned bucket and began the slow process of rebuilding what the storm had torn down. It was work that required a patience beyond ordinary human endurance, the willingness to start from the beginning as many times as necessary until the lesson finally took hold. Tom had learned that kind of patience from his failures as much as his successes, understanding that true progress often looked like standing still, to those who measured achievement in quick victories. Sabbath watched from his safe distance, ears flicking forward and back as he processed Tom's quiet presence. The horse was torn between the memory of partnership and the more recent experience of terror, unsure which version of reality he could trust. It was a conflict that Tom understood better than most, having spent years navigating the gap between what he had been and what he feared he had become. The breakthrough came not through any particular technique or strategy, but through the simple persistence of showing up every day with the same gentle intentions. On the third morning after the storm, Sabbath took a tentative step toward the fence, then another, until he stood close enough for Tom to extend his hand through the rails. "There you are," Tom murmured as Sabbath's velvet muzzle touched his palm. "I was wondering when you'd decide I was worth talking to again." The reunion was sweeter for having been lost and found again. When Tom finally entered the paddock and Sabbath allowed the halter to be fitted without resistance, it felt like a victory earned rather than simply achieved. They had weathered their first real crisis together, and both had chosen to continue the relationship despite the setbacks. By the end of that week, Tom had accomplished something that none of his predecessors had even attempted. He had introduced Sabbath to the concept of carrying a saddle. The process had taken days of careful preparation, starting with a saddle blanket draped across the horse's back, while Tom maintained a constant stream of reassuring conversation. "This is just clothing," Tom explained as Sabbath investigated the unfamiliar weight with nervous sidesteps. "Nothing to be afraid of. Lots of horses wear saddles. It's like a comfortable chair that moves with you." The saddle itself was Tom's own, a working cowboy's tool rather than the ornate showpieces favored by men like Jake Morrison. The leather was weathered to a soft brown patina, molded by years of hard use into shapes that spoke of long days and longer rides. It had been one of the few possessions Tom had refused to sell when the ranch failed, though he hadn't been entirely sure why at the time. Sabbath's acceptance of the saddle marked a turning point in their relationship and in Tom's growing reputation around Jasper's Bluff. Word spread quickly that the old cowboy had actually managed to saddle the infamous black stallion without getting himself killed in the process. The news was received with varying degrees of amazement, skepticism, and resentment, depending on the audience. Delilah's reaction was unqualified admiration, mixed with a growing personal interest in the man who was proving himself worthy of her late husband's memory. She found herself looking forward to their morning conversations with an anticipation that had nothing to do with Sabbath's training and everything to do with Tom's quiet wisdom and gentle humor. "Marcus would have liked you," she told him one morning as they watched Sabbath investigate a new piece of equipment with careful curiosity. "He had the same way of listening to horses that you do. Said they told him everything he needed to know, if he just paid attention." Tom felt a warmth at the comparison that went beyond simple professional pride. Marcus Vane had been a legend in these parts, the kind of horseman that other horsemen spoke of with hushed respect. To be mentioned in the same breath was an honor that Tom had stopped believing he deserved. "I'd like to think so," he replied carefully. "From what I've heard, he was the kind of man this country needs more of." Their conversations had begun to range beyond horses and training, touching on subjects that revealed the depth of both their experiences and their loneliness. Delilah spoke of the challenges of managing a successful business while maintaining her independence in a world that still preferred women to be quietly supportive rather than actively successful. Tom shared his regrets about the choices that had cost him his family and his legacy, though he was careful never to sound as though he was asking for pity. "Do you ever think about trying to contact your son?" Delilah asked one day, the question arising naturally from their discussion of family and forgiveness. Tom's hand went unconsciously to his shirt pocket, where Danny's latest letter rested against his heart like a talisman he was afraid to examine too closely. "Every day," he admitted, "but I'm not sure what I'd say to him. Sorry I lost everything you were supposed to inherit." Doesn't seem like much of a conversation starter. "Maybe he's not looking for apologies," Delilah suggested gently. "Maybe he's just looking for his father." The idea was both terrifying and seductive, carrying with it the possibility of redemption but also the risk of final rejection. Tom had grown accustomed to living with the pain of separation. He wasn't sure he could survive having the door closed permanently. As Sabbath's training progressed, so did the challenges that came with success. Jake Morrison's resentment had metastasized into something approaching obsession, fueled by the daily evidence that Tom's unconventional methods were producing results that traditional horse-breaking techniques had failed to achieve. Jake's companions at the Silver Dollar had begun to drift away, uncomfortable with the increasingly bitter tone of his complaints. "It ain't natural," Jake insisted to anyone who would listen. "A horse like that don't just roll over and play nice without there being something wrong with the man handling him. Mark my words, there's trickery involved, or worse." The accusations were becoming more specific and more dangerous, moving from general skepticism towards suggestions of actual wrongdoing. Jake had begun to hint that Tom might be using drugs or other artificial means to calm Sabbath, implications that could destroy not just Tom's reputation, but his safety if they were believed by the wrong people. Tom became aware of the growing hostility gradually, through changed attitudes and suspicious glances that followed him through town. The isolation didn't surprise him. He had learned to expect rejection as the natural state of his existence. But it added a layer of urgency to his work with Sabbath, knowing that his success would need to be overwhelming and obvious to overcome the doubts that were being systematically planted in the community's mind. The physical demands of training were taking an increasing toll on his aging body. His back, already damaged by decades of ranch work, was protesting the long hours spent bending and stretching to accommodate Sabbath's needs. Some mornings, Tom could barely rise from his narrow bed, relying on hot coffee and sheer determination to carry him through another day of careful, patient work. Mrs. Henderson had begun leaving bottles of liniment outside his door, a gesture of concern that she would never admit to making. The bottles appeared without comment or acknowledgement, but Tom understood the kindness behind them and was grateful for this small evidence that someone in his increasingly hostile world still cared about his welfare. The breakthrough moment came on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks into their partnership, when Tom finally climbed into Sabbath's saddle for the first time. The horse stood perfectly still as Tom's weight settled into the familiar leather, his ears forward with attention rather than backward with resistance. "Easy, boy," Tom murmured, though his own heart was pounding with the significance of the moment. "Just like we've been practicing, nothing different except I'm up here with you now." They stood together in the center of the paddock, man and horse united in a partnership that had been built on mutual respect and understanding rather than dominance and submission. When Sabbath took his first tentative steps with Tom on his back, it was not because he had been broken, but because he had chosen to cooperate. From her kitchen window, Delilah watched this milestone with tears in her eyes, understanding better than most what it meant for both participants. She had seen her share of horse training over the years, but never anything that looked quite like this, a collaboration between equals rather than a contest of wills. The successful first ride marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, one that would test not just their partnership, but Tom's ability to withstand the increasing pressure from those who resented his success. The road to the August rodeo was still long and uncertain, but for the first time since accepting Delilah's challenge, Tom began to believe that it might actually be possible to reach the finish line with both his dignity and his horse intact. The small silver trophy sat on Tom's windowsill like a monument to better days, its once bright surface now tarnished with age, but still bearing the inscription that had made his heart swell with pride 20 years ago. Danny Rusk, junior champion, Jasper County Fair 1885. The boy in his memory had been all elbows and excitement that day, his gap-toothed grin wide enough to split his face as he clutched the trophy with hands that barely seemed large enough to hold it. Tom had carried that trophy through every move, every setback, every moment when the weight of his failures threatened to crush what remained of his hope. It represented not just his son's achievement, but his own success as a father, proof that he had once been capable of nurturing something precious into bloom. Now it served as a daily reminder of everything he had lost, and perhaps if he was very careful and very lucky everything, he might yet have a chance to redeem. The unexpected arrival of Danny Rusk in Jasper's Bluff came on a Wednesday morning in late May, when the spring air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers and the promise of summer lay just beyond the horizon. Tom was in Sabbath's paddock, working on the subtle communication that would be essential for their success in the rodeo ring, when he heard the sound of wagon wheels on gravel and looked up to see a familiar figure climbing down from the Denver stage. At 32, Danny had grown into the kind of man that Tom had always hoped he would become, tall and straight-backed, with intelligent eyes and hands that spoke of honest work. He wore the clothes of a successful businessman, well-tailored but not flashy, and carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from knowing his own worth. But there was something in his posture as he stood in the dusty street, looking toward his father with an expression that mixed longing with old anger, that reminded Tom of the uncertain boy he had once been. "Hello, Pa," Danny said simply, his voice carrying across the paddock with a formality that cut deeper than any curse could have. Tom's hands stilled on Sabbath's reins, his heart suddenly pounding with a mixture of joy and terror that left him momentarily speechless. He had dreamed of this moment countless times, but in his imagination it had always been different, easier, somehow, without the weight of accumulated failures and unspoken recriminations that now hung between them like morning fog. "Danny," he managed finally, his voice rough with emotion, "you're looking well. Chicago's been good to you." The conversation that followed was careful and stilted, full of the polite exchanges that strangers might make, rather than the easy communication of father and son. Danny had come west on business, something to do with railroad contracts and shipping arrangements, but Tom suspected that professional obligations were not the only reason for the journey. The painful history between them emerged gradually over the following days, revealed in fragments during encounters that felt simultaneously natural and forced. Danny's anger about the past had not diminished with time or distance. If anything, it had crystallized into something harder and more enduring than the hot rage of youth. "You gave up," Danny said bluntly during one of their awkward conversations, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "When things got difficult, when the drought came and the prices fell, you just gave up. Ma saw it first, but I saw it too. You stopped fighting for what mattered." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Tom had given up, in the end. Not all at once, but gradually, in small surrenders and compromises that seemed reasonable at the time but added up to the complete abandonment of everything he had sworn to protect. He had let the ranch slip away, let his marriage dissolve, let his son walk out of his life rather than fight for what could have been salvaged. "You're right," Tom admitted quietly, the words harder to speak than any he had ever uttered. "I stopped believing I could win, so I stopped trying. That's on me, not on the drought or the bank or anybody else." The honesty seemed to catch Danny off guard, as if he had been prepared for excuses and self-justification, but not for the simple acknowledgement of failure. His anger wavered for a moment, revealing glimpses of the hurt and disappointment that lay beneath it like bedrock beneath topsoil. But forgiveness, Tom was learning, could not be rushed any more than trust could be forced. Danny's visit stretched from days into a week, then 2, as he found reasons to delay his return to Chicago. He rented a room at the hotel rather than staying with his father, maintaining a physical distance that reflected the emotional gap that still yawned between them. During this time, Sabbath's training continued with the methodical precision that had characterized it from the beginning. The horse had progressed to accepting not just the saddle, but the full range of equipment that would be required for the rodeo competition: spurs, chaps, the specialized gear that marked the difference between a casual rider and a serious competitor. Danny watched these sessions with the critical eye of someone who had grown up around horses and understood the subtleties of good horsemanship. Despite his resentment toward his father, he could not help but be impressed by the partnership that had developed between the difficult stallion and the patient man who had somehow earned his cooperation. "That's quite a horse," Danny observed one morning, leaning against the fence rail as Tom put Sabbath through a series of exercises designed to test their communication and coordination. "He's special," Tom agreed, his attention focused on the subtle signals that passed between him and the stallion. "Took me a while to understand what he needed, but once we figured each other out, everything else started falling into place." There was something in his father's voice when he spoke about the horse that Danny remembered from his childhood, a quality of attention and respect that had once been directed toward him. The memory was painful and sweet at the same time, a reminder of what they had shared before pride and circumstance drove them apart. Delilah had been observing the family drama with the wisdom of someone who understood both love and loss. She began to make subtle efforts to bring father and son together, inviting them both for meals and creating opportunities for conversation that might not have occurred naturally. "Your father talks about you all the time," she told Danny during one of these carefully orchestrated encounters. "He's proud of what you've accomplished in Chicago, proud of the man you've become." "He has a strange way of showing it," Danny replied, but his tone lacked the bitter edge that had characterized his earlier comments about his father. "Pride makes fools of us all sometimes," Delilah said gently. "The question is whether we're brave enough to admit when we've been wrong." The relationship between Tom and Delilah had been deepening throughout the spring, moving gradually from professional cooperation towards something more personal and complex. Their morning conversations had become the highlight of both their days, offering a respite from loneliness that neither had fully acknowledged until it began to be filled. Tom found himself looking forward to these talks, with an anticipation that had nothing to do with Sabbath's training and everything to do with the woman whose intelligence and warmth had begun to heal wounds he had thought permanent. Delilah, for her part, discovered in Tom's quiet strength and gentle wisdom qualities that reminded her why she had fallen in love with her husband while being uniquely his own. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked him one morning as they watched Sabbath demonstrate the latest skills he had mastered. "I try not to," Tom admitted. "The future's been nothing but disappointment for so long that I've gotten in the habit of just focusing on today." "Maybe it's time to change that habit," Delilah suggested quietly. The physical challenges of training were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Tom's back problems, already severe, were being aggravated by the long hours in the saddle and the constant need to maintain perfect posture while working with Sabbath. Some mornings, the pain was so intense that he could barely mount the horse, relying on willpower and carefully rationed doses of laudanum to carry him through his daily sessions. Danny began to notice his father's struggles, seeing past the careful facade to the genuine suffering beneath. The observation stirred emotions that he had thought safely buried under years of resentment, concern, protectiveness, and the remnants of love that had never entirely disappeared despite everything that had happened between them. "You're hurting," Danny said, after watching Tom gingerly dismount from a particularly challenging training session. "Nothing I can't handle," Tom replied automatically, the denial coming as naturally as breathing. "That's what you always said," Danny observed, "right up until you couldn't handle it anymore." The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and old pain. But this time, instead of walking away from the conversation, Danny stayed. This time, instead of making excuses, Tom listened. "Maybe I was wrong about that too," Tom said finally. It was not an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack in the wall that had stood between them for so many years. Danny felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger that he had carried for so long that it had become part of his identity. The breakthrough in their relationship came gradually, built on small moments of honesty and understanding rather than dramatic gestures. Danny began helping with Sabbath's care, his own skills with horses rusty but still fundamentally sound. Working together toward a common goal, they began to rediscover the easy communication that had once made them more than just family. They had been friends. "He's really something," Danny said one evening as they watched Sabbath graze peacefully in the gathering dusk. "He reminds me of you when you were young," Tom replied quietly, "proud, particular about who he trusts, but willing to give everything once he decides you're worth it." The comparison was the closest Tom had come to expressing the depth of his regret about their estrangement, and Danny felt the words settle into a place in his heart that had been empty for too long. As June stretched toward July and the rodeo drew nearer, the little family that had reformed around Sabbath's paddock began to feel like something permanent and precious. Tom's success with the horse had given him back more than his confidence. It had given him back his son, and perhaps, if he was very fortunate, a future that looked nothing like his past, but everything like hope. The letter from Dr. William Hayes arrived on a Tuesday morning in early July, delivered by the same postal clerk who had carried unopened correspondence from Danny for years. But this envelope bore the official letterhead of the Jasper's Bluff medical practice, and Tom's hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal, already knowing in his heart that the news would not be what he wanted to hear. The diagnosis was written in the precise, clinical language that doctors used when they needed to deliver devastating information without allowing emotion to cloud their professional judgment. Degenerative disc disease, the letter explained, complicated by compression fractures in 3 vertebrae and inflammation of the spinal cord that was causing progressive nerve damage. The medical terminology was foreign, but the conclusion was clear enough. Continued riding would likely result in permanent paralysis and possibly death if the damaged discs shifted far enough to sever his spinal cord completely. Tom read the letter 3 times, each reading making the reality more inescapable. Dr. Hayes recommended immediate cessation of all horseback riding activities, complete bed rest for at least 6 weeks, and consideration of experimental surgical procedures that offered, at best, a 50% chance of stabilizing his condition without guaranteeing any improvement in his current symptoms. The irony was not lost on him. Just when he had found something worth fighting for again, just when his relationship with Danny was beginning to heal and his partnership with Sabbath was approaching perfection, his own body was betraying him in the most fundamental way possible. The horse that represented his last chance at redemption might also be the instrument of his destruction. He sat in his small room at the boarding house for nearly an hour, the letter lying open on the rough wooden table, while he stared out the window at the mountains that had defined his entire life. Those peaks had watched him grow from boy to man, had witnessed his successes and failures, had remained constant while everything else in his world shifted and changed. Now they would outlive him, as they had outlived everyone he had ever known or would know. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke him from his reverie. Mrs. Henderson was making her morning rounds, checking on her tenants with the gruff affection that passed for maternal care in her establishment. Tom folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, next to the most recent correspondence from Danny that he still had not found the courage to open. The morning training session with Sabbath proceeded normally, though Tom found himself hyper-aware of every twinge in his back. Every moment when his balance shifted in ways that might have gone unnoticed before, but now carried the weight of potential catastrophe. The horse seemed to sense his distraction, performing the required exercises with less enthusiasm than usual, and occasionally turning his great head to study his rider with dark, intelligent eyes. "Something's bothering you today?" Delilah observed from her position at the fence rail. She had developed an uncanny ability to read Tom's moods, a skill that came from weeks of careful attention and growing affection. Tom dismounted carefully, trying not to wince as the movement sent a sharp spike of pain up his spine. "Just thinking about the rodeo," he said, which was true enough without being complete. "Getting close now makes a man nervous." But Delilah had not survived as a businesswoman in a man's world by accepting easy explanations when deeper truths were available. She studied Tom's face with the same intensity she brought to evaluating potential horse purchases, looking for the subtle signs that would reveal what he was really thinking. "Tom Rusk," she said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "You've been many things since I've known you, but nervous has never been one of them. What's really going on?" The temptation to confess everything was almost overwhelming, Tom had grown accustomed to carrying his burdens alone, but the weight of this particular secret felt heavier than anything he had ever tried to shoulder. The knowledge that he was risking his life and possibly his ability to ever walk again for the sake of a horse show seemed both noble and foolish at the same time. But before he could formulate a response, Danny appeared around the corner of the barn, his businessman's clothes replaced by the practical clothing of someone who intended to work with horses. In the weeks since his arrival, he had gradually taken on more responsibility for Sabbath's daily care, grooming the stallion and maintaining his equipment with the skilled hands of someone who had not forgotten everything his father had taught him. "Morning, Pa," Danny said, his greeting warm but still carrying the careful formality that marked their slowly healing relationship. "How did Sabbath do today?" "Good as always," Tom replied, though his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. "He's ready for whatever comes next." Danny's sharp eyes caught the subtle change in his father's demeanor immediately. The business world had taught him to read people carefully, to notice the small tells that revealed when someone was hiding important information or struggling with difficult decisions. His father was displaying all the signs of a man carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. The discovery of Tom's medical diagnosis came about by accident, as many life-changing revelations do. Danny was helping his father organize the equipment needed for the final weeks of training when the letter slipped from Tom's jacket pocket and fell to the stable floor. The official letterhead caught Danny's attention immediately, and before Tom could stop him, he had picked up the document and begun reading. The change in Danny's expression was immediate and dramatic. Color drained from his face as he absorbed the medical terminology and understood its implications. When he looked up at his father, his eyes held a mixture of fear, anger, and desperate concern that took Tom back 20 years to moments when his young son had needed comfort and protection from dangers he couldn't fully understand. "How long have you known?" Danny asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Does it matter?" Tom replied, reaching for the letter with hands that trembled slightly. "It matters to me," Danny said, pulling the document back and reading it again, as if hoping the words might change with repetition. "It says here that continued riding could kill you, or leave you paralyzed for life, and you've been keeping this to yourself while climbing onto that horse every day like nothing was wrong." The conversation that followed was the most honest exchange they had shared since Danny's return to Jasper's Bluff. Stripped of pretense and careful politeness, they spoke as father and son, rather than as strangers trying to navigate the wreckage of their shared history. Tom's explanation was simple and devastating in its clarity. He had spent years feeling like a failure, watching everything he had built crumble away until nothing remained but regret and empty days. Sabbath represented his last chance to prove that he was still capable of something meaningful, still worthy of respect and perhaps even love. The risk to his life seemed small compared to the certainty of spending his remaining years as a broken old man whose best days were behind him. "You're not the same man who lost the ranch," Danny argued, his voice passionate with conviction. "I've seen you with that horse. I've watched you build something beautiful from nothing but patience and understanding. You don't need to risk everything to prove you're worthy." But Tom's decision had been made with the same quiet determination that had characterized his entire approach to training Sabbath. He would continue with the rodeo preparation, accepting the risks because the alternative, giving up when success was finally within reach, felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked to become. "Maybe that's what courage looks like for men like me," he said quietly, "not charging into battle with guns blazing, but standing up when standing up might cost you everything." The news of Tom's condition spread through their small circle with the speed of a prairie fire. Delilah's reaction was immediate, and forceful. She offered to release him from their agreement immediately, arguing that no horse, no matter how special, was worth risking a human life. "You can't ask me to be the reason you die," she said, tears streaming down her face as she spoke. "I won't carry that weight. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my foolish pride." But Tom's response surprised everyone, including himself. The prospect of death or paralysis, rather than making him more cautious, had instead clarified what truly mattered to him. He was not doing this for Delilah, or for the townspeople who doubted him, or even for his own wounded pride. He was doing it for the relationship he had built with Sabbath, for the trust that connected them, and for the man he had discovered himself to be in the process of earning that trust. "I'm not sacrificing myself," he explained to the small group gathered in Delilah's parlor as son, the woman he was learning to love, and the memory of his late husband that seemed to hover over all their discussions. "I'm finally living up to the promises I made, to Sabbath, to you, and to myself." Danny's pleading was the hardest to resist because it came from love rather than fear. His son, who had spent years angry at his father's failures, was now terrified of his father's courage. The irony was not lost on any of them, but it did nothing to make the situation easier to bear. "Don't you see?" Danny said desperately. "I just got you back. I can't lose you again, especially not like this." The reconciliation between father and son had been one of the unexpected gifts of Tom's journey with Sabbath, but now it was being threatened by the very circumstances that had made it possible. Danny's fear of losing his father again was competing with Tom's need to complete what he had started, creating a conflict that had no easy resolution. Tom's decision to continue training despite the medical risks represented more than simple stubbornness or masculine pride. It was the choice of a man who had finally found something worth dying for, and who understood that some victories could only be achieved by those willing to risk everything in pursuit of them. As the summer sun set over Jasper's bluff that evening, casting long shadows across Sabbath's paddock, Tom sat on his favorite bucket and watched the stallion graze with the peaceful contentment of a creature at harmony with his world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new fears, but tonight there was only the quiet satisfaction of a job well begun and a partnership that had transformed both participants. The choice had been made, and Tom Rusk was finally at peace with the consequences. The battered black Stetson that had belonged to Tom's father sat on the dresser in his boarding house room, like a crown, waiting for coronation day. The hat had seen 3 generations of Rusk men through their finest and darkest hours, its felt worn soft by decades of sun, rain, and honest sweat. Tom's grandfather had worn it while driving cattle north to the railroad. His father had worn it through the harsh winter of 1862 that killed half the livestock in the valley, and Tom himself had worn it on his wedding day, the day Danny was born, and the day he lost the ranch. Now, with the annual rodeo just 3 days away, the hat seemed to carry the weight of all that history, all those accumulated hopes and failures that had brought him to this moment of reckoning. Tom lifted it reverently, feeling the familiar contours that had been shaped by the heads of men who shared his blood and his dreams, and placed it carefully on his own graying hair. The final preparations had taken on a quality of ritual that went beyond simple training. Every piece of equipment was inspected and re-inspected, every strap and buckle tested for weakness that might prove catastrophic at the crucial moment. Tom's saddle had been cleaned and oiled until the leather gleamed like burnished mahogany, its silver conchos polished to a mirror shine that reflected the morning light like captured stars. Sabbath seemed to sense the approaching culmination of their long journey together. The stallion carried himself with a new energy during their practice sessions, his movements sharp and precise, his responses to Tom's subtle cues immediate and confident. There was something in his dark eyes that spoke of anticipation rather than anxiety, as if he understood that everything they had worked for was about to be tested before the eyes of the world. The entire town of Jasper's Bluff had become invested in the outcome of their partnership. What had begun as a source of amusement and skepticism had transformed into something approaching reverence as word spread of Tom's medical condition and his decision to continue despite the risks. Men who had mocked his gentle methods now spoke of his courage in hushed tones, and women who had dismissed him as a washed-up failure now crossed themselves when his name was mentioned. Even Jake Morrison's hostility had evolved into something more complex and uncomfortable. The younger Cowboy had built his identity around being the best horseman in the valley, but Tom's success with Sabbath had forced him to confront the possibility that skill and flash were not the same thing. His accusations of trickery had fallen on increasingly deaf ears as the community began to understand what they were witnessing, not the breaking of a horse's spirit, but the forging of a partnership between equals. "I don't understand it," Jake admitted to his remaining companions at the Silver Dollar, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance. "That old man is half crippled and twice as stubborn as that black devil he's riding, but somehow they fit together like they were made for each other." The admission was as close to an apology as Jake's pride would allow, and it marked the beginning of a grudging respect that would have seemed impossible just months before. The community that had once viewed Tom as an object of pity or ridicule was beginning to see him as something else entirely, a man who had faced his demons and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. Delilah had thrown herself into the final preparations with the intensity of a general preparing for battle. Her stables had never looked better, every surface scrubbed and painted, every piece of equipment organized with military precision. She supervised the construction of temporary seating for the spectators who were expected to arrive from as far away as Denver, all drawn by the story of the broken-down cowboy and the horse that nobody else could ride. But beneath her efficient exterior, Delilah was struggling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her careful composure. She had grown to love Tom Rusk with a depth that surprised her, discovering in his quiet strength and gentle wisdom qualities that complemented rather than competed with the memory of her late husband. The thought of losing him, whether to death, paralysis, or simply the inevitable conclusion of their business arrangement, filled her with a dread that made it difficult to sleep or eat or think about anything else. "He's going to be fine," she told herself repeatedly, the words a mantra against fear. "He's the most careful man I've ever known, and that horse would die before he'd hurt Tom." But privately, she had made arrangements that reflected her deeper fears. Dr. Hayes would be present at the rodeo with his medical bag and a wagon ready to transport injured riders to his clinic. The nearest hospital, 2 days' ride away in Colorado Springs, had been notified to expect a possible emergency patient. She had even written letters to be delivered in the event of the worst-case scenario, messages that would ensure Tom's final wishes were honored, regardless of what happened in the arena. Danny's presence had become both a comfort and an additional source of anxiety for his father. The young man had extended his stay in Jasper's Bluff indefinitely, telling his employers in Chicago that family obligations required his continued attention. He spent his days helping with Sabbath's care and his evenings writing long letters that he never sent, trying to capture his feelings about his father's courage and his own terror at the prospect of losing him, just as they were learning to be a family again. "I should have stayed angry," Danny confided to Delilah one evening as they watched Tom work with Sabbath in the fading light. "It would be easier to watch him risk everything if I still resented him for the past." "Love always makes things more complicated," Delilah replied, understanding better than most the truth of those words. "But it also makes them worthwhile." The community's support had manifested in practical ways that touched Tom's heart more deeply than grand gestures ever could have. Mrs. Henderson had quietly reduced his rent to nothing, claiming that his room needed repairs that would make it uninhabitable for paying guests. The blacksmith had refused payment for shoeing Sabbath, insisting that the privilege of working with such a magnificent horse was compensation enough. Even the postal clerk had begun delivering mail with a tip of his hat and a genuine smile, treating Tom like the important citizen he had once been rather than the charity case he had become. But it was the arrival of unexpected visitors that truly demonstrated how far word of Tom's story had spread. Cowboys from neighboring ranches began appearing at Delilah's stables, not to mock or criticize, but to watch the final training sessions with the respectful attention of students observing a master. They came quietly, hat in hand, asking permission to witness what many were already calling the most remarkable display of horsemanship anyone had ever seen. "Never saw anything like it," murmured old Pete Garrison, the man who had once declared Sabbath to be possessed by the devil. That horse moves like he's reading that man's mind. The technical aspects of their partnership had indeed evolved into something approaching telepathy. Tom could guide Sabbath through complex maneuvers with shifts in weight so subtle that observers often missed them entirely. The stallion responded to the pressure of Tom's legs, the position of his hands, even the direction of his gaze, with a precision that seemed to transcend normal horse and rider communication. But the deeper magic lay in their emotional connection, the trust that had been built through months of patient interaction and mutual respect. Sabbath had not been broken in any conventional sense. He had been invited into a partnership that honored his dignity while channeling his power toward a common goal. The result was a collaboration that was both beautiful to watch and impossible to replicate through traditional training methods. The physical challenges that Tom faced had not diminished with time or determination. If anything, his condition had worsened as the stress of training took its toll on his damaged spine. He had begun relying on a leather back brace that Danny had ordered from Chicago, a contraption that provided some support while remaining invisible beneath his shirt. The pain medication that Dr. Hayes reluctantly provided helped with the worst episodes, but it also clouded his judgment in ways that made it dangerous to use during actual riding. The letter he wrote to Danny on the night before the rodeo was perhaps the most difficult document he had ever composed. It contained all the words he had been unable to speak during their years of estrangement, all the love and regret and hope that had been bottled up inside him like wine aging in darkness. "Son," it began, "if you are reading this, it means that tomorrow didn't go as we hoped. But I want you to know that these last few months have been the happiest of my life, not because of the horse or the competition, but because I got to watch you become the man I always knew you could be. You are everything I should have been, but was too proud or too scared to become." The letter went on to express his gratitude for Danny's forgiveness, his love for Delilah, and his hopes that the two of them might find comfort in each other if the worst should happen. It was a document written by a man at peace with his choices, whatever their consequences might prove to be. As the sun set over Jasper's Bluff on the eve of the rodeo, Tom sat in Sabbath's paddock, with his journal open on his knees, recording what he hoped would not be their final conversation. The stallion stood quietly beside him, occasionally nuzzling his shoulder or blowing softly through his nostrils in the way that had become their private greeting. "Tomorrow, boy," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying across the still evening air. "Tomorrow we find out if all this work has been worth the price we've paid for it." Sabbath's response was to lower his great head and rest it gently on Tom's shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that needed no translation. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together, as partners who had found in each other something precious and rare, in a world too often governed by force rather than understanding. The championship was within reach, but more importantly, Tom Rusk had already achieved something far more valuable. He had proven to himself and to everyone who mattered that a man could be measured not by his failures, but by his willingness to rise from them, not by his youth, but by his wisdom, not by his strength, but by his courage to be gentle, when gentleness was what the world needed most. The championship's saddle gleamed in the morning sun like a piece of fallen heaven, its hand-tooled leather decorated with silver conchos that had been crafted by the finest artisans in Santa Fe. It sat on display at the judge's table, waiting for the cowboy skilled enough and brave enough to claim it as his own. The prize represented more than just victory, was validation, recognition of mastery in a craft that separated men from boys and legends from forgotten names. The annual Jasper's Bluff Rodeo had grown over the years from a local gathering of ranchers showing off their skills to a regional competition that drew participants from 3 states and territories. This year, the crowd was larger than ever, drawn by stories of the unusual partnership between a washed-up cowboy and an unrideable horse. Special trains had brought spectators from as far away as Kansas City, and the temporary grandstands that Delilah had commissioned were filled to capacity with people who had come to witness what many were calling the most anticipated ride in rodeo history. Tom stood at the edge of the arena, His father's black Stetson pulled low over eyes that betrayed none of the pain that shot through his spine with every breath. The leather back brace beneath his shirt felt like a cage around his ribs, but it was the only thing keeping him upright as waves of agony threatened to buckle his knees. He had taken the minimum dose of laudanum that Dr. Hayes deemed safe enough to take the edge off his suffering, but not so much as to cloud the reflexes that might mean the difference between life and death. Sabbath stood beside him with the calm dignity of a king surveying his domain. The stallion's black coat had been groomed to perfection, each hair lying flat and gleaming like polished obsidian. His mane had been braided with leather strips that matched Tom's chaps, and his hooves had been oiled until they shone like mirrors. But it was his bearing that truly set him apart from the other horses in the competition, the way he held his head high without arrogance, the way his dark eyes surveyed the crowd with interest rather than fear. The early competitors had provided entertainment that ranged from competent to spectacular, but none had achieved the perfect harmony between horse and rider that the judges were looking for. Cowboys from the Lazy J, the Circle K, and half a dozen other outfits had demonstrated their skills with varying degrees of success, but each ride had contained moments of conflict, instances where horse and rider worked against each other rather than in perfect unison. Jake Morrison had drawn the slot immediately before Tom, a piece of scheduling that felt like either cosmic justice or cruel irony, depending on one's perspective. The younger cowboy had prepared for this moment with the same intensity that had characterized his entire approach to competition, pushing his paint gelding through exercises designed to showcase speed and flash rather than subtlety and communication. When Jake's name was called, he entered the arena with all the swagger and confidence that had made him the betting favorite among those who still believed that youth and strength mattered more than patience and wisdom. His horse was Magnificenta Pinto, with the bloodlines and training that money could buy, and Jake himself cut an impressive figure in his silver-studded chaps and hand-tooled boots. The ride began well, with horse and rider moving through the required patterns with precision and speed that drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. Jake's technique was flawless, his seat secure, his hands steady on the reins. He guided his mount through the obstacle course with the kind of aggressive confidence that had served him well in countless competitions, demanding performance and getting it through superior skill and iron will. But as the ride progressed, the subtle signs of strain began to show. Jake's horse, for all his training and bloodlines, was responding to commands rather than anticipating them, following directions rather than participating in a true partnership. The difference was nearly invisible to casual observers, but the judges saw it, and more importantly, Tom saw it. "Beautiful horse," Tom murmured to Delilah, who had positioned herself at the rail where she could watch both the competition and Tom's condition for signs of distress. But they're having a conversation where only one of them gets to talk. Jake's performance concluded to enthusiastic applause, and he dismounted with the satisfied smile of a man who believed he had just secured his victory. His time was excellent, his technique beyond reproach, and his horse had performed without a single misstep. As he led his pinto from the arena, he paused near Tom with an expression that mixed respect with residual resentment. "Good luck, old man," he said, the words carrying a grudging acknowledgement of Tom's courage. "Whatever else happens out there, you've got more sand than I gave you credit for." It was as close to an apology as Jake's pride would allow, and Tom accepted it with a nod that conveyed understanding rather than forgiveness. There had been too much history between them for easy reconciliation, but perhaps there was enough respect now for a different kind of peace. The announcement of Tom's name sent a ripple of anticipation through the crowd that was unlike anything the rodeo had ever experienced. This was not the polite applause reserved for competent performers or the enthusiastic cheering that greeted crowd favorites. This was something deeper and more complex recognition of a man who had chosen to risk everything for reasons that transcended simple competition. Danny appeared at his father's elbow, his face pale but his voice steady as he offered the kind of support that only family could provide. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said quietly. You're already the bravest man I know." Tom's response was a smile that carried 20 years of regret and 3 months of redemption. "I'm not doing this to prove anything to anyone else," he replied. "I'm doing it to keep a promise I made to a horse who trusted me when nobody else would." Delilah stepped forward then, her emotions barely contained behind the facade of businesslike composure that she had maintained throughout the morning. She reached up to adjust Tom's hat with the careful attention of a woman sending her man off to war, knowing that this might be the last time she would have the chance to touch him while he was whole and healthy. "Come back to me," she whispered, the words meant for his ears alone. "Win or lose, just come back to me." Tom's response was to lean down and kiss her forehead with a tenderness that spoke of promises made and futures hoped for. It was a gesture that acknowledged both the depth of their connection and the uncertainty of what the next few minutes might bring. As Tom approached Sabbath, the stallion turned toward him with the eager anticipation of a partner who had been waiting for this moment as much as any human in the arena. The horse's dark eyes held intelligence and trust in equal measure, and when Tom placed his hand on the warm neck, he could feel the steady heartbeat that matched the rhythm of his own pulse. "This is it, boy," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying across the sudden stillness of the crowd. "This is what we've been working toward all these months, just you and me doing what we do best." The mounting process was accomplished with the careful precision of a ritual, each movement deliberate and controlled. Tom's damaged back screamed in protest as he lifted himself into the saddle, but his face betrayed none of the agony that threatened to overwhelm his senses. Sabbath stood perfectly still during the process, as if he understood that his rider needed extra time and care to achieve the position that would allow them to perform as one. When Tom finally settled into the familiar leather and gathered the reins in his weathered hands, the transformation was immediate and visible. The pain that had been etched in the lines around his eyes seemed to fade, replaced by the focused intensity of a craftsman approaching his masterwork. Sabbath felt the change as well, his muscles coiling with the controlled power of a spring compressed and ready to release. The arena fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the wooden grandstands and the distant sound of a meadowlark calling from somewhere beyond the mountains. Even the horses in the nearby corrals seemed to sense the importance of what was about to unfold, standing quietly with their ears pricked forward toward the center of attention. Tom touched his heels to Sabbath's sides with the gentlest pressure, and the stallion moved forward with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill. There was no jerking or pulling, no conflict between what the rider wanted and what the horse was willing to give. They moved as one entity, sharing thought and intention in ways that made it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The crowd released its collective breath in a sigh of wonder as horse and rider began their performance, and even the most experienced horsemen in the audience found themselves leaning forward to witness something they had never seen before, a perfect partnership between man and animal, built on trust rather than dominance, communication rather than control. This was not just a ride, this was poetry in motion, a dance choreographed by months of patient work and performed by partners who had learned to trust each other with their lives. The blue silk ribbon that would crown the champion fluttered in the mountain breeze like a captured piece of sky, its satin surface catching the afternoon light as it waited to fulfill its destined purpose. Tom had dreamed of that ribbon during the long nights when pain kept sleep at bay, imagining how it would feel to have his worth validated before the eyes of everyone who had written him off as a broken-down failure. But now, moving through the arena in perfect harmony with Sabbath, Tom realized that the ribbon had become secondary to something far more precious, the absolute trust between him and the magnificent animal beneath him. They flowed through the required patterns with a grace that transformed competition into art, each movement building upon the last until the crowd forgot they were watching a horse show and began witnessing something closer to magic. Sabbath responded to Tom's subtle weight shifts as if they shared a single nervous system, turning left when Tom's left leg pressed gently against his ribs, backing up when Tom's hands barely tightened on the reins, stopping and starting with transitions so smooth they seemed to happen by mutual agreement rather than command and obedience. The obstacle course that had challenged every previous rider became a mere formality for the partnership that had been forged in patience and sealed in mutual respect. Sabbath wove between the poles with the fluid precision of a dancer, his hooves never touching the wooden markers, even though the spacing required movements measured in inches rather than feet. When they approached the log that competitors were required to jump, Sabbath gathered himself with the controlled power of a coiled spring and sailed over the barrier with room to spare, landing so smoothly that Tom barely felt the impact. In the grandstands, spectators who had come expecting entertainment found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people leaned forward to get a better view of the man and horse who seemed to be communicating in a language that transcended words or visible signals. Children pointed with wide eyes, and their grandparents nodded with the recognition of people who had lived long enough to know when they were seeing something truly special. "Lord have mercy," breathed Mrs. Henderson from her seat in the front row, her usual gruff demeanor replaced by wonder. "I've never seen the like of it." The judges, experienced horsemen all, found themselves exchanging glances that mixed professional admiration with personal amazement. They had officiated hundreds of competitions over the years, watched countless riders demonstrate their skills with varying degrees of success, but none had ever seen the seamless partnership that Tom and Sabbath were displaying. This was not a human dominating an animal or an animal tolerating a human. This was collaboration in its purest form. As the ride continued, Tom felt the familiar burn of pain spreading through his damaged spine, but it seemed distant and unimportant compared to the joy of perfect communication with his four-legged partner. Sabbath was performing beyond even Tom's highest expectations, his every step demonstrating the intelligence and nobility that Tom had seen in him from their first meeting. The crowd was on its feet now, their initial polite attention transformed into genuine awe as they watched something that would be talked about for generations. Even Jake Morrison, his own competitive instincts temporarily set aside, found himself applauding with the rest of the spectators, his earlier resentment overwhelmed by recognition of true mastery. The final element of the competition required horse and rider to demonstrate their partnership through a series of rapid direction changes that tested both communication and athletic ability. Sabbath approached this challenge with the enthusiasm of an athlete in perfect condition, his muscles rippling beneath his gleaming coat as he pivoted and spun with balletic precision. Tom's hands on the reins were so light they seemed to barely make contact with the leather, yet Sabbath responded to every subtle indication with immediate understanding. Left, right, back, forward the stallion moved through the sequence with the fluid confidence of a creature that had found perfect harmony with his human partner. As they completed the final turn and headed toward the center of the arena, where tradition demanded they stop for the judges' final evaluation, Tom felt a moment of perfect clarity that made all the pain and risk worthwhile. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it, not victory or vindication, but the simple joy of doing something extraordinarily well with a partner who trusted him completely. Sabbath came to a halt in the precise center of the arena with the controlled grace of a dancer hitting their mark, his sides barely moving despite the exertion of the previous minutes. Tom sat straight in the saddle, despite the agony that was beginning to reassert itself in his spine, his weathered face showing none of the pain that threatened to buckle his resolve. The silence that followed their performance was complete and profound, as if the entire crowd was holding its breath while trying to process what they had just witnessed. Then, starting with a single person in the back of the grandstand, applause began to build like a gathering storm, spreading through the crowd until it became a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the wooden structures and echo off the surrounding mountains. People were standing now, not just clapping but cheering with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for heroes returning from war. Hats sailed into the air, and more than one weathered cowboy wiped tears from his eyes without shame or apology. They had come to watch a competition, but they had witnessed something far more significant: the triumph of patience over force, understanding over dominance, and heart over circumstance. Danny vaulted over the arena rail and ran toward his father, his businessman's dignity forgotten in the emotion of the moment. Delilah followed more carefully, her skirts hampering her progress, but her face shining with pride and relief. Even the judges abandoned their usual formal protocol, approaching Tom and Sabbath with the respect due to artists who had just delivered a masterpiece. The announcement of the winner was a mere formality. Tom Rusk and Sabbath had not just won the competition, they had redefined what it meant to achieve perfect partnership between human and animal. The blue ribbon was placed around Sabbath's neck with ceremony befitting a coronation, and the championship saddle was presented to Tom with words of recognition that acknowledged not just his skill but his courage in pursuing excellence despite overwhelming obstacles. But as Tom accepted the accolades and tried to smile for the crowd that continued to cheer his name, the pain in his back reached a crescendo that could no longer be ignored. The adrenaline that had carried him through the ride was fading, leaving behind the full weight of his medical condition and the price he had paid for this moment of glory. He managed to dismount from Sabbath with the same careful control that had characterized his riding, but once his feet touched the ground, his legs gave way beneath him. He collapsed in the arena dirt, still clutching Sabbath's reins, the championship ribbon fluttering in the wind above them both, like a banner of victory that had cost everything to claim. The crowd's celebration turned to concerned silence as Dr. Hayes rushed into the arena, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with professional concentration. Danny reached his father first, dropping to his knees in the dust without regard for his expensive clothes, his hands gentle but desperate as he tried to determine the extent of Tom's collapse. "Pa," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Pa, talk to me." Tom's eyes opened, focusing with effort on his son's worried face. Despite the pain that threatened to overwhelm his senses, he managed a smile that conveyed satisfaction rather than suffering. "Did we win?" he whispered, though the blue ribbon around Sabbath's neck made the question unnecessary. "You won," Danny confirmed, tears streaming down his face. "You won everything that matters." Above them, Sabbath stood guard over his fallen partner, his great head lowered protectively, as if he understood that the man who had given him dignity and purpose now needed protection in return. The stallion's dark eyes reflected the same concern that showed in every human face surrounding them, proof that the bond they had forged transcended species and would endure regardless of what the future might hold. The partnership agreement between Tom Rusk and Delilah Vane was signed 3 months after the rodeo, the ink still wet on paper that represented not just a business arrangement, but a new beginning built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Tom's signature was steadier now than it had been in the weeks following his collapse, though his recovery had been longer and more uncertain than anyone had dared hope during those first dark days when Dr. Hayes spoke in whispers about permanent paralysis and the possibility that the man who had achieved perfect harmony with an untamable horse might never walk again. But Tom Rusk had proven himself to be as stubborn about healing as he had been about everything else that mattered to him. The weeks of bed rest that followed his triumph had been the most difficult of his life, not because of the physical pain, though, that had been considerable, but because of the forced separation from Sabbath and the work that had given his life meaning again. Danny had brought him daily reports from the stables, describing how the stallion seemed to be waiting for his partner's return, with the patient loyalty of a friend who understood that some things were worth waiting for. The morning Tom finally managed to walk to Sabbath's paddock without assistance marked a turning point, not just in his recovery, but in his understanding of what the future might hold. The stallion had approached the fence with the same gentle enthusiasm that had characterized their first meeting, and when Tom rested his hand on the familiar neck, both man and horse seemed to release breath they had been holding for months. "Hello, boy," Tom had whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Miss me?" Sabbath's response had been to blow softly through his nostrils and lean into Tom's toucher, greeting that conveyed more than words ever could about the bond that had survived both triumph and trauma. The new arrangement that emerged from Tom's recovery was more generous than anything he had dared imagine during his darkest moments. Delilah had offered him not just employment, but partnership in the management of her stables, recognizing that his skills as a trainer were too valuable to waste on mere hired-hand duties. The position came with a small house on the property, a modest salary, and most importantly, the daily opportunity to work with horses that responded to his gentle methods with the same trust that Sabbath had shown. Danny's decision to leave Chicago permanently and join his father in the horse training business had surprised everyone, including himself. The young man had discovered during his extended stay in Jasper's Bluff that the satisfaction he found in working with animals and helping to heal the relationship with his father far exceeded anything his successful but sterile business career had provided. The partnership they formed was built on mutual respect rather than the traditional hierarchy of father and son, each bringing different strengths to their shared enterprise. "You taught me something about patience," Danny told his father one evening as they watched a young colt learn to accept a halter under Tom's gentle guidance. "I spent so many years angry about the past that I forgot to pay attention to the present." Tom's response was the kind of smile that had become more frequent since his recovery began, at the careful expression of a man guarding against disappointment, but the genuine warmth of someone who had learned to accept good fortune when it arrived unexpected and undeserved. The romance that bloomed between Tom and Delilah was conducted with the careful dignity of people who had learned that the most precious things were often the most fragile. Their courtship consisted of long conversations over morning coffee, shared meals that stretched into evening discussions about horses and dreams, and the strange ways that life could surprise people who had stopped expecting surprises. When Tom finally worked up the courage to propose marriage, he did it in Sabbath's paddock at sunset, with the stallion serving as witness to a promise between two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of their respective puzzles. Delilah's acceptance was given with tears and laughter in equal measure, and her kiss tasted of hope and second chances. The wedding itself was a simple affair held in the garden behind Delilah's house, with Sabbath wearing ribbons in his mane and serving as unofficial ring-bearer. The ceremony was attended by most of Jasper's Bluff, including Jake Morrison, who had become one of Tom's most dedicated students in the months following the rodeo. The younger Cowboy had discovered that there was more satisfaction in earning a horse's cooperation than in forcing its submission, and his own skills had improved dramatically under Tom's patient instruction. The training methods that Tom had developed through his work with Sabbath began to attract attention from horsemen throughout the territory. Young cowboys traveled from hundreds of miles away to spend weeks learning techniques that emphasized communication over domination, patience over force. Tom found himself becoming something he had never expected, a teacher whose influence would extend far beyond his own achievements. "It's not about breaking them," he would tell his students as they worked with horses that had been deemed difficult or dangerous by previous trainers. "It's about finding out what they need from you and then being willing to provide it. Horses want to cooperate. They just need to trust that cooperation won't be used against them." The transformation of Sabbath from an unrideable rebel to a willing partner had become legendary throughout the region. But Tom understood that their story was about more than just training techniques. It was about the possibility of redemption for any human or animal who had been written off as hopeless. It was proof that patience could accomplish what force never could, that understanding was more powerful than dominance, and that the most meaningful victories were often achieved by those who had learned to redefine what winning actually meant. On quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and the mountains turned purple in the fading light, Tom would often sit on the front porch of his small house and watch Sabbath graze in the paddock that had become their shared kingdom. Delilah would join him with 2 cups of coffee, and they would talk about the future with the comfortable ease of people who had learned to appreciate the present. Danny had begun courting Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher who had arrived from Denver the previous spring, and their engagement had been announced with the kind of celebration that small towns reserved for events that promised continuity and hope. Tom looked forward to grandchildren who would grow up around horses and learn from their earliest years that strength was not the same thing as force, that leadership meant service rather than dominance. The legacy that Tom was building extended beyond his immediate family to encompass anyone who had witnessed his partnership with Sabbath and understood its deeper meaning. His story had become part of the folklore of the region, the tale of a broken man who had refused to stay broken, who had found in an untamable horse the key to his own redemption. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Tom's transformation was the quiet confidence that now characterized his daily life. Gone was the defeated resignation that had marked his arrival in Jasper's Bluff, replaced by the steady assurance of a man who knew his own worth and had stopped depending on others to validate it. He had learned that success was not the absence of failure, but the willingness to rise from failure with grace and determination. As winter approached and the first snow dusted the mountain peaks, Tom found himself looking forward to the challenges and opportunities that the coming seasons would bring. There were young horses to train, students to teach, and a family to build with the woman who had seen past his failures to the man he was capable of becoming. Sabbath, now recognized throughout the territory as one of the finest horses ever bred in the region, continued to serve as both partner and teacher. The stallion had sired several foals who inherited his intelligence and noble bearing, ensuring that his legacy would continue through future generations. But more importantly, he remained Tom's daily reminder that the most valuable things in life could not be taken by force. They could only be offered freely by those who chose to trust. The sun was setting over Jasper's Bluff as Tom closed his journal and prepared for another peaceful evening in the life he had built from the ashes of his old failures. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to prove that patience and understanding could accomplish what seemed impossible to those who relied on force and fear. In the distance, Sabbath lifted his magnificent head and nickered softly, a sound that carried across the evening air like a greeting between friends. Tom smiled and touched the brim of his father's old hata gesture that connected him to generations of horsemen who had understood that the greatest victories were won, not through conquest, but through partnership, not by breaking spirits, but by healing them, not by demanding submission, but by earning trust, one careful day at a time.